Socrates was a famous Greek philosopher who once said the following: "He who is not content with what he has will not be content with what he would like to have." In other words, what Socrates is saying there is that greedy people will never be satisfied. And we know that to be true as we look into our own hearts and also as we look to the world around us. Our greed can never ultimately be satisfied. Greed is an evil which causes chaos personally, but also collectively. And that's a principle we see to be true in 1 Kings chapter 21. You might recall we've been following the history of Israel, and Israel at this point is a divided nation. 10 tribes constitute the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes constitute the southern kingdom of Israel, also known as Judah. And in recent chapters of 1 Kings, we've been really focusing on the northern kingdom of Israel, and at this point, King Ahab is the man on the throne. In chapter 21, we're introduced to a man called Naboth, and Naboth owned a vineyard which King Ahab looked at and thought, "I would like that vineyard for myself." This vineyard lay right beside Ahab's palace, and so he thought that would be the perfect piece of land for me. But it didn't seem to matter how much money King Ahab offered Naboth, he was totally unwilling to sell. And while it might have been greed that motivated Ahab to try and take this vineyard, it wasn't necessarily greed which motivated Naboth to keep a hold of it. You see, according to the law, you should keep a hold of the land which your ancestors passed down to you unless you were in extreme poverty and in desperate need of cash. Apparently that doesn't describe Naboth's situation, and so according to the law, he desires to keep a hold of his vineyard. But this is where we see the petty entitlement of King Ahab. As he is unable to buy this vineyard off Naboth, he goes home in a sulk and he tells his wife Jezebel as to what happened. She effectively tells her husband to catch a grip of himself and to leave it in her hands. And so she comes up with a secret, sly ploy to try and steal the vineyard off Naboth. She writes a letter to some of the elders of Naboth's town and tells them to get 2 scoundrels to accuse Naboth of blasphemy. The punishment for blasphemy on account of 2 witnesses is death. And so Naboth is ultimately put to death by his own people because of this false story created by Jezebel, and so now the vineyard is available for King Ahab to take. As we've learned so far in 1 Kings, however, God does not treat sin lightly, and so he sends once again his prophet Elijah to confront Ahab. He asks Ahab, "Isn't it enough that you've killed this man Naboth? Now you have to steal from him as well?" And so he issues a judgment on Ahab. He says, "You will be destroyed and your wife Jezebel will ultimately be fed to the dogs." King Ahab, in response to this, is remorseful, and because of his remorse, God in his mercy actually offers him a lighter sentence, but maintains that his dynasty will be taken from him. And so isn't it amazing that God shows mercy even on someone like King Ahab? Someone who is a down and out, someone who deserves God's mercy less than we might say anyone else. How does this encourage you as you think about the people that you know who seem hostile to God, alienated from him? God is willing to lavish mercy on whoever asks for it. But after this episode, we do ultimately see not just the mercy of God, we also see his justice. Justice would be upheld. Ultimately, all of these judgments that God warned would come, did come. If you want to see them in their fullness, read 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10. God is true to his word. He's a God of mercy and he's a God of justice.